Carmel Sepuloni.
Mr Speaker, I had scheduled to be here in Wellington on Saturday thinking that we would have work to do following the government's budget announcement. But actually, Mr Speaker, because the budget was such a non-event, we struggled to even be here till 12 o'clock on Friday. So I think the general public would be a little bit concerned about the fact that here they had these huge expectations of the budget and were presented with nothing, and actually here we are supposed to be working on this big budget, any of the announcements that might have come out of it, and there was nothing, Mr Speaker. It was rather disappointing. I think the only highlight was, well, actually it was my 39th birthday on Saturday, and it was nice to be back in the electorate. Mr Speaker, National has failed to deliver not only for New Zealanders who are experiencing hardship, but also middle New Zealand on issues that matter, Mr Speaker: housing, health, education and the economy. Budget 2016 does nothing to fix the housing crisis. It cuts health and education even further in real terms and sees middle New Zealand getting a smaller slice of the economy. The failure to meaningfully tackle the housing crisis tops off 8 years of failure from the national government. A Labor budget, Mr Speaker, would have taken decisive action on housing, boosted funding for health and education, and ensured middle New Zealand got its fair share of economic growth, as well as addressing the hardship that many New Zealanders are experiencing. And the fact it was such a non-event of a budget, Mr Speaker, meant that actually what we ended up with are costs to households, increased in costs to households. Because of National's out-of-touch approach to budget 2016, the reality is that households will pay more. Wages aren't going up, Mr Speaker, as quick as inflation over the next 2 years. We already know this. Next year, house prices are forecast to rise by 8%. Last year, they rose at twice the rate that was forecast. Auckland's first home buyers are already spending more than half their income on mortgage repayments. Now they will have to pay more, Mr Speaker. Households will end up forking out more for insulation or heating after the government cut back on insulation subsidies. Education costs are rising at 10 times the rate of inflation, meaning parents will pay more. And I've just mentioned there all the monetary costs. That doesn't even cover off the social costs that we as a country are going to have to pay, Mr Speaker. And talking about social costs, I really want to move over to the government's social investment approach. What is the social investment approach, Mr Speaker? Now, let's just discuss the social investment approach a little bit more widely. CPAG had breakfast the day after the budget was announced, and our social services across the country are very clear that this social investment approach is not working in any way. The social investment approach that we have from the national government is about short-term cost saving rather than investing in people, which will have long-term benefits. It really is about smaller government, and that's all it is about, Mr Speaker. Social investment should be about making sure families are better off, not just making sure that they come off benefit. In so many situations we've seen people have come off benefit, but have they gone on to do anything more that makes their family more successful or improves outcomes for their families? Well, actually, that government's not measuring that. National social investment approach views people as liabilities rather than the important assets, resources that they are, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, social investment shouldn't be about managing risk. It should be about investing in people. So I'm so sick of hearing the national government go on about their so-called social investment approach. If we critique it a little bit more, it's not social investment, Mr Speaker, but rather targeting those labelled by National as fiscal drains. For example, in Bill English's budget speech, he picks on young parents, saying that the average 19-year-old sole parent will spend 18 years on a benefit. We still can't find where he got that information from. In fact, I've had to put PQs in, referring to Bill English's quote, to try and find out where he got that information from. Because I've worked with 19-year-old sole parents, Mr Speaker, and I don't know any of them that have stayed on benefit for long term, particularly 18 years. So I really want to question some of the perceptions that the national government are creating. This stigmatises young people, Mr Speaker, and we've seen it not only with their so-called social investment approach and the labels that they put on people, including fiscal drain, but also the other labels we've heard them use, like Bill English being quoted as referring to young people in New Zealand as pretty damned hopeless in relation to them being able to get into employment. What hope do our young people have when they've got a government that has so little aspiration for these young people, Mr Speaker? In fact, going back to some of their 2008 slogans, it was supposed to be. We were supposed to have a brighter future under this national government. They were supposed to be the party that was aspirational for New Zealand, Mr Speaker. Well, we haven't seen aspiration for middle New Zealand or those experiencing hardship. The only people they seem to have aspiration for, Mr Speaker, are the mega wealthy, the people in the top 1%, those people who actually don't need any more help, those people who are doing okay by themselves, but actually probably doing a little bit better with help from their mates in the national government. Going back to the social investment approach and critiquing that, Mr Speaker, if we look at the testing that's been done around the package that they've introduced, and we try and see whether or not there's any evidence approach to it at all, we see there's been no testing. So what we have here is a $652 million package that the government is looking to implement when they haven't tested it, and there's been no critique of the design, and they have no idea on that side of the house whether it will actually work. The measure of success of the social investment approach from that side of the House is based on problematic outcomes. Rather than aiming for economic self-actualisation and the long-term well-being of children and families facing hardship, the short-term fiscal gains are the key priority. That's why they have things like their better public service target to reduce welfare dependency, but it doesn't go any further in terms of ensuring that those families are better off, Mr Speaker, because all it's about is short-term gains. And our concern on this side of the House is that if that is all the government is focused on, then down the track we're going to see some pretty major social implications to that short-term view. We're going to see further costs to the country as we seek to resolve the things that the government didn't address at the time they had an opportunity to do so. Mr Speaker, our failure to invest in our future now will lead to higher costs in the future for children growing up in poverty and with no or inadequate accommodation. The impacts this will have on them are huge and difficult to undo later in life. So hearing the Minister of Social Development, Anne Tolley, talk about her package and her wanting to address the needs of vulnerable children is all good. But if these children and these families don't have a roof over their head, Mr Speaker, then how much traction can any government truly make? If we want to talk about a social investment approach, then we really need to talk about investment into education. So I really want to touch on early childhood education funding. I have a 3-year-old, and the first thing that his centre manager said to me when I saw her on Monday this week was that she was so disappointed with what the budget had to offer with respect to early childhood education, Mr Speaker. That government has talked up the fact that they need to invest in early childhood education, that they want to increase participation, and yet they haven't followed that up with any additional funding to ECE. And in fact, what we see here is that because of the lack of funding offered by that government, we're seeing centres having to subsidise what they should be getting from the government with increases to parents. And this is what I was talking about before with regards to the fact that many of the costs that haven't been covered by that government are now being pushed on to New Zealanders, Mr Speaker. I'm not going to get through the list of things I wanted to talk about, but I do want to touch on emergency housing. National's budget has failed to address the growing housing crisis. In fact, they're fighting amongst themselves about whether or not it is a crisis or a challenge or something else. Their measures are insufficient to reverse the decline in home ownership, stop kids living in cars, or ensure homes are warm and dry. Mr Speaker, every New Zealander out there knows that we're experiencing a housing crisis. So every time that government tries to turn around and say it's not a crisis, there is no housing crisis, people are rolling their eyes going, how can you lie to us? How can you say that when it's so evident, not only with their own ability to be able to pay their rent or purchase a house, but every day when they go to their local shopping centres, walk out on their street and are confronted with levels of homelessness that we've never seen here in New Zealand before. Mr Speaker, this was a non-event of a budget. That government should be ashamed of themselves, and I think New Zealand will be judging them based on what costs the government have now pushed onto onto middle New Zealand households.
The Honourable